This is a joint hearing of House Education and Senate Education, as soon as they arrive on Friday, May 9th, 2025. This joint hearing is focused on two issues: special education in Vermont, and then the role of Medicaid in education. We have got a lot of information that is presented. I suggest everybody have it open. The agency was sent just a number of questions in order to sort of elicit some data for us. And that's what's here to be presented. Thank you for the work on this and for frankly turning it around quickly. And we really look forward to sort of the information that we're going to get on special education. It is a major cost driver, yet also complicated and somewhat, our understanding of it tends to be somewhat limited. So anyway, Madam Secretary, the floor is yours, and thank you for being here.
Great. Thank you. Good afternoon. For the record, I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education, and I'm joined by many members of the team at the Agency of Education. The analysis that we put forward is a cross-cutting analysis, so we will be providing an update on spending along with some programmatic outcomes. The report that we uploaded directly responds to the specific data request, but we felt it would be helpful to position those requests within the broader context. So within the report, there's additional detail that provides further background around how we are funded and some other trends and analysis that we've put together for you. We've been signaling for a little bit that we would like to put together a comprehensive report for special education, because we know that that is an intense area of focus. So we offer this as a broader overview. We will highlight some of the key trends that we've analyzed. And we also want to lay out some of the planned activities to strengthen special education delivery. The Agency of Education is very focused on really strengthening the fundamentals of our work. And we are happy and pleased to share some of the work underway in the special education arena to do that. So in this report, we will focus on talking about the data request related to the delivery and also the cost of special education. We know that this work is really complex and requires a multi-year approach. We are looking at this from the lens of ensuring that we can equitably resource schools, enhance accountability and training, and also improve service delivery through some considerations around restructuring and enhanced coordination. We've noted some areas where we think would be helpful to have additional policy review, including cooperative education service sharing and new approaches and oversight of therapeutic schools, which we originally proposed in the governor's plan early in this session. So I'm going to orient you to the report and how we are going to run through this. I want to also give you peace of mind that we do not plan to read 30 pages to you. So I'll say that up front, but we do have this for your reference, and we would anticipate that there will be further questions and we can build upon this in subsequent conversations. So on page 2, you'll see a table that outlines the specific data request that we received. And you'll identify here the page number within this report where we provide the data, charts, and analysis. We also did populate a table upon the request of House Ways and Means that is included in your packet as a subsequent data artifact. So I'm going to walk through some of the key takeaways from this entire report. And then we have a number of team members that will be drilling down into specific sections. So after I walk through an overview, we will turn it over to Meg Porcella to talk about the federal compliance and monitoring. So you have some background and context around that as we look at some of the high-level trends around special education and the current state of delivery in Vermont. We'll then turn it over to Sean Cousineau, who will do a deeper dive into SPED funding, talk specifically about Act 173 related to the funding mechanisms and then the revenue trends. We'll turn it back over to Meg at that point to walk through some of the student demographic trends that we thought would be helpful to highlight. From there, we'll transition to Jen Hicks, who will give you an overview of the student outcomes for those students with an IEP and also students that are in a therapeutic setting. And from there, we will move into a deeper dive and talking about the extraordinary expenses. And Alicia Hannaran will do that from our team. And from there, we'll wrap up for kind of broader questions and exploring policy considerations. So with that, I'm just going to highlight some of the key takeaways from the analysis that we conducted. So one area of inquiry that we received was related to understanding better the students that are requiring the extraordinary costs in those placement patterns. So what we have found is the number of students requiring extraordinary cost reimbursements is rising significantly. These students are disproportionately served in independent or therapeutic settings. And we'll do a breakdown around what specific disability categories they tend to represent. We also see in our analysis that some regions of the state lean more heavily on extraordinary cost reimbursements. We are recognizing in this report that we're not showing causality. We are also bringing out that there are other connections and review that needs to be done further to understand the relationship to district size, service availability, and that part of the state, and we'll continue to do further analysis. Another area of inquiry was looking at the outcomes for those students with an IEP. We do see in our data, on our state assessment data, that students with IEPs consistently score 30 to 40 percentage points lower on these assessments compared to their peers. Another area related to assessments is really isolating those students that are in a specialized setting. Want to note that we have, of course, patient or student privacy considerations as we look at this data. So what you'll find in the report is more of a descriptive analysis. And we are seeing patterns that those students that are enrolled in therapeutic schools perform slightly below peers in other settings, and particularly in math. We are going to note as we get into that section that the results vary by grade and disability. So it does make it really challenging to draw broad conclusions, and also it's a much smaller portion of our student population. So keep that in mind as we're analyzing those trends. And lastly, we received a request to review LEA level spending patterns. We did find that there is great variability in spending across districts. Smaller districts tended to have higher average expenditures, but we do want to note that relationship was not statistically significant. There was no relationship between per student expenditures and district need in whether or not they tuitioned the secondary grades. There was a relationship between per student expenditures and the percentage of students with an IEP, specifically districts that have a lower percent of students on an IEP tended to have higher expenditures. So they were serving fewer students, but it tended to be more costly. Probably what we would expect as we kind of think about general principles around economies of scale and making those services available. So we have a lot more detail in those areas embedded within the report, but we wanted to start with the high level takeaways to frame our discussion. And so with that, I will turn it over to Meg. And if you introduce yourself also for the record before you get into your section.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. For the record, I'm Meg Porcella. I'm the Director of the Student Support Services Division at the Agency of Education. And I'd also like to introduce our State Director of Special Ed, Cassie Santo, who is not able to be here physically, but is here on the phone. And there she is. So while I have the document in front of me and will be providing the high level overview or just orienting to some of the information in the document, Cassie is the person who will be answering questions. So please, if you have questions, ask away. We'll get the good information from her. Thank you for being here. So just to orient for the state of special education in Vermont, there are around 16,000 students, and the information that is contained on page 4, if you're following along, comes from a PowerPoint presentation that we provided, mainly the State Board of Ed brought it around to a couple different places, but we wanted to highlight a few high categories. So our disability categories, and again, the drilled down data is later on in this report. Preschool environments, we have most of our children with IEPs in age 3, 4, and 5 receive the majority of their special education services in the regular childhood settings. Similarly, with kindergarten through 12th grade environments, we have good numbers for least restricted environments for children getting most of their education in that general education classroom. There are some trends around student demographics, assessment participation, which is an area where we need to improve. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And that is students with an IEP who take the state assessments, especially I believe it's 8th grade language arts and 4th and 8th grade math. And then our post-school outcomes. So it looks like a good number. 87% of our teens no longer in secondary school with an IEP were either enrolled in higher education or in some other post-secondary education. But our number is that we're trying to aim for is in the 90s, 95%. So regarding Vermont's federal compliance, Vermont, if you see the chart there, has been in the determination we call needs assistance for several years. And that designation comes from several data points that we report to the Office of Special Ed Programs annually in our annual performance report for our state performance plan, which we call the SPP APR, even though I just said the letters backwards. The determination status comes from what I just highlighted, the number of students that are not participating in the statewide assessment, graduation rates for students with disabilities while decreasing dropout rates, as well as ensuring students with IEPs have a transition plan. So those 3 items are the main drivers for our being in the needs assistance category. And there is a lot of information along with a linked document, how the department made determinations in 2023 that drills down into the story behind the numbers of what it means for us to have scored a 0 or a 1 or a 2 on the rubric that OSEP uses. And I think that context is important to know. Just anecdotally, it's also not anecdotal, incidental. The way Vermont compares to the rest of the states. So, for example, if the threshold for all states for graduation rates was 95%, there would still be a ranking of all 50 states. And so Vermont could still get a 0 in that category, even though we were still at the number that we wanted to be. And that's not trying to diminish the fact that Vermont does have work to do, and we'll talk about the work that we're doing, but also knowing how the numbers are derived is important context. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. So just wanted to clarify as this is an important framing. So the state of Vermont has been out of compliance since 2018. And we are reestablishing our monitoring cycles. We're developing more differentiated accountability processes. We're expanding our technical assistance to support in this area. We also want to note that there are some system-wide challenges for the state of Vermont to be in compliance with the Office of Special Education Programs. And so that's part of what we will discuss further as we unpack some of these data trends. And I think will be particularly important as you're contemplating policy in the education transformation context, because there are some real recommendations that come out of this around how we can improve our coordination system-wide as a state to better support special education delivery.
Did you say 2018, Secretary Saunders?
Yes.
Thank you.
So that
And it's
is,
a 2-year lag, so do you want to talk about that? So that backward.
yes. So
So
the,
just briefly, I think
Yeah.
if you could just expand on, so the designation was issued in 2018, so there's a lag with the data. So I just want to clarify that that's representative of, I think, 2 years prior. Right, so we're 2
Yes.
years in the rear when we're getting these designations.
good.
Is that correct?
Did you want to,
Cassie,
yeah,
did-
see Cassie popped on. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to clarify that yeah, what the reporting that would have come out in 2018 was in reference to school year 2016. So reporting that we're talking about from last year, from 2024, is referencing school year 2022. That would be the most recent reporting that we're referencing now.
And you can see that in the chart. So that federal fiscal year 2022 was the information on that SPPAPR, the state's sort of report card, so to speak, for special education that's available. At the end of June, we will have the 2023 information. So everything, there's a lag.
So the work that is being implemented now, we're not going to see, right?
Right.
Accounted for in the designation that we'll receive in June.
Correct. So, so that was the high level, our federal monitoring. And so at the state, we're also addressing, as Zoe just referred, getting back to the fundamentals of how the state monitors our LEAs, SUSDs. They're referred to both ways in this document. I just wanted to point that out. Sometimes we call them SUSDs, sometimes we call them LEAs. That's the federal term. For us, for me, for this report, they mean the same thing. The central office where the superintendent sits, type of thing. So some of the changes to monitoring, and I welcome if I see Cassie, you turn on your camera, I will let you fill in some of the gaps. But there's been a redevelopment of how we monitor LEAs over the past several years, and the plans to continue to address needs and evolve how we monitor our LEAs to provide better technical assistance to get better outcomes is part of the special education's plan. One of the main changes is redesigning some of the way that our local special ed determinations are being made. And Cassie, go ahead. You're gonna bail me
Just as
out?
we're
Yeah.
assessed at the state level, we do that.
Yeah,
as
I'm
yes,
going to
assessed
try to give
at state
a
level.
high level, guys.
Go
and,
ahead. Thank you.
Feel free to ask questions, because if I go too high and I miss something, I can try to come back down. But essentially, we also have a report that we share with districts, which we call their local special education determinations, very similar to what OSAP is doing in our direction. So we have a monitoring system that is looking at LEA data and looking at some of those same indicators. And so some of the big work that we've been doing in the past several months is partnering with the National Center for Systemic Improvement and really digging into our integrated monitoring. How do we do all of this? How do we do the cyclic pieces, which is every 6 years, we have to monitor an LEA and look at certain data points. We're doing that every 5 years, but we've been revamping how we do that, how we decide what level of monitoring goes into that when we're coming up on a cyclic cycle. Is a district going to need more a standard monitoring approach or a more intensive? So we're sort of developing those processes. And then in terms of the LSEDs, we are also reestablishing how we measure those determinations that we're making in regards to needs assistance, meets requirements, because we're providing that same score to a district. So we're really looking at how we do that as well, and realigning that work. And then another pocket of monitoring is really what happens off cycle. And you'll see this sort of described in the report more eloquently than I might do right now. But we monitor districts on a cyclic basis, but that doesn't mean that concerns don't come in when districts aren't in cyclic monitoring. And we've really needed as an agency to come up with a process for what we do in those sort of off cycle times, because there has been concerns in the realm of special education and what is our role in stepping in and supporting and really figuring out what technical assistance is needed. So we've been establishing what we're calling a due diligence review, which is our approach to that process within the off-cycle monitoring world. So that's sort of a really high level summary of the work that's been going into that. We expect the manual to be released in July. And yeah, that's the high level summary of that.
Perfect. That's perfect. Any questions before we transition to Act 173 and funding?
Cass, if you could just briefly speak to the ways in which we're trying to break down service delivery silos, both at the agency level and also with the field.
Absolutely. Well, I think our team is confined within the Student Support Services Division, and we've really been trying to step out and model what we want to see in the field, which is that special education is not other, it is not separate. We're all in this together, right? It's all of our students, and students on an IEP are general education students first, and we need to carry that truth as an agency as well. So we're really just trying to come together. We're doing a training in August, which is across the agency. I want to say every division is represented at this point with a variety of trainings. Yeah, it's true. Okay. Intended to support outcomes for students. So we're going to dive into licensing conversations, eligibility. We have content experts sharing about their work. And so we're all coming together as an agency to host that opportunity. And then we also have a conference coming up in October where we are inviting special education directors, their other administrators to join us. Again, across the division, the divisions of the agency are going to be there sharing their work and really just trying to build community, not really build community outside of special education, right? Really to bridge those worlds so that we're all, again, back together talking about this work and thinking about all students holistically. And I think more to come. There's a lot of talk about developing more cross-training opportunities, just expanding the ways in which we collaborate.
I think it's a good
Hopefully
segue also
Perfect.
to talking about the objectives of Act 173. So I'll let Meg walk through that.
We couldn't have planned that any better. So we're about to transition into talking about the change to the funding model that resulted from Act 173. And just the orientation, the idea about Act 173 was to enhance the effectiveness, availability, and equity of services for students who struggle, to any student, all students, not only students with an IEP or a 504 plan. And it also shifted the funding mechanism, which you'll hear about in just a moment. And ideally, the shift was to simplify how educators in the field had to do their paperwork around special education, which, as much as we could change, the federal government didn't change along with us, but that was one of the intended results. But the big idea was to make sure that all students would receive the support they needed when they needed it. So not after they had already failed or were in some kind of crisis, when they needed it, by the most qualified and skilled providers. And then that also required, so that's the education piece, the teacher piece, but then also that districts and schools would implement a comprehensive system of supports. And in Vermont, that's our Vermont MTSS framework. And that would ensure that early intervention, high quality instruction. And then we have the 5 goals that we hear frequently that came from the district management group report, and those are listed on the bottom of page 7. But those are those best practices that, yes, we want the majority of students to be able to get what they need from the gen ed classrooms. And we want, when students need extra intervention, which is extra instruction, that instruction is provided by highly qualified personnel. We want to make sure that that students who struggle are getting that extra instruction in addition to their core instruction, not instead of it. That there needs to be included with that multi-tiered system of support for academics, like we cannot exclude behavior. They have to be together. And so there needs to be a comprehensive system for that. And then like it mentions skilled experts 3 times. So the gist of that report and the gist of Act 173 is really heavy on making sure that kids are getting what they need from highly qualified and skilled personnel. And it changed our funding model. And with that, I think, you want me to?
Why, are we gonna be returning to how we're doing on those 5?
Yes, we will.
Okay.
Yes, we will. Specific to, as students, what we know about students. Yes.
I'll just speak to that. The data requests, I think, are really focused on providing an understanding to you of how we're doing in terms of delivering high quality special education services in a way that's cost efficient. And so we've approached this work as we've done in other areas of the agency by looking at the data. We've identified some of the compliance challenges. We've analyzed the implementation of prior legislation, and that is all informing the work that we are doing at the agency in really strengthening our support and our monitoring protocols. This is a strategic focus of our plan that we are developing. This also came out very clearly through our Listen and Learn tour as an area that we really needed to strengthen. So you'll be hearing about all of those pieces in this presentation.
There is a perception, whether it's, which I think is true, that the highly qualified personnel across the state, that there's a shortage of special education teachers. I'm wondering if any thought in your division, if there's been any thought around retention and recruitment of more highly qualified personnel, I think is what you call them.
And so special education teachers, general education teachers, and also those providers of some of those specialized services like speech language pathologists and behavioral interventionists. So yes, and this is one of those areas where it's an agency-wide and maybe even a statewide need. So yes, in the Student Support Services Division, we are trying to address maybe not so much explicitly the retention, but definitely the professional development needs that might exist. Also with mentoring, making sure that special educators are getting some of the information that they need. The wider conversation about why people aren't flocking to be working in education or in special education is an important conversation for sure.
And that exact line of inquiry is being explored within our licensing team. Also, we've been having conversations with the Special Education Advisory Panel to really understand what may be contributing to some of the turnover in this particular space around special education. And as we think about the transformation work, it's really trying to understand the root cause and being able to support that. So one of the ways that we've talked about with this committee is really trying to achieve teacher pay equity, and that being an important component of being able to recruit and retain our high quality teachers. We're also focusing, doing a lot of coordinated work with our educator prep programs as well to strengthen the pipeline.
Thank you.
Let's get to the emerging pathways and how we're working paraprofessionals as well as a new pathway to moving from paraprofessionals to more.
Yeah, so as part of the work in our licensing division is recognizing that we really do need to create this talent pipeline. And we have a number of paraeducators in our schools that are really interested in getting their certification. So we are developed a specialized pathway, and we're working also with our higher ed partners on that.
Is that what you were going to speak to, Cassie?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. Licensing has been, and our team has been engaged with CEDAR. They're the Center for Educator Development and Retention. I believe they're another OSEP-funded TA center. Our licensing division has been a part of that group for a long time, and they've supported us a lot with developing these pathways. We have another alternative pathway to licensure where we've developed mentoring modules for mentors to support incoming special education teachers. And I think it's an arena that we have continued work to do. So just wanted to add that.
So our plan, if it works with your objectives, would be to move now into looking actually at the expenditures. Then we'll come back and we'll talk about the outcomes, and then we can have a conversation. So with that, I'll turn over to John Cusno and also Jill Burks Campbell.
Cognizant of time, and it's a lot. We're covering a lot. Do you all have that additional time to give today? Okay.
We may, if we have to bump the Medicaid discussion for another time, we may have to do that, but.
No, they're also pretty brief, so you might still be able to squeeze them in. All right, Jill Burks Campbell, Deputy Secretary for the record.
Sean Cusno, Deputy CFO. All right, I wanted to go over, it starts on page 8 of our document, the funding ecosystem section. And we have special ed is funded with, of course, state funds and federal funds mainly. Our state funding, we have 2 types of grants. We have per student grants, the census block grant, early in the EEE grant, the early essential education grant. And then there's a couple of reimbursement grants, the extraordinary special ed and the state placed students grant program. Let's see, the per student grants seem to, they grow slower over time because they're based on a student count and then like a base amount. And so as our students kind of are declining in Vermont, because these are overall students for the census block grant, as that continues to decline, in theory, this grant will start declining once we get through the transition period. And then the reimbursements are based more on actual costs, and we are seeing more extraordinary students coming into the system. So we're seeing big increases in that grant program. And, you know, any special ed costs that these 4 programs don't cover, they end up in the education spending grant, and which then affects the local budgets and the homestead tax rates, correct? Moving on to the next page, you can see a table of our census block grants as it's slowly climbing, and that'll continue to climb through the transition period. And then if we keep the base number the same without inflating it, you know, that's where we'll start to see it possibly decline depending on the student count. And we've got a nice table for EEE showing that's kind of slow growth, consistent growth, I guess. But extraordinary, I think, is where a lot of people want to focus today. And I think we move on to page 10.
We have math.
Yes,
We
with
brought math for your after lunch enjoyment.
with Act 173, there was a change in the extraordinary calculation. So it basically puts more money into the system for extraordinary students. And we can go over the math if you want. But part 2 is the new section. And it looks like in FY 23, that new calculation put 17.5 million more into the formula. So that's 17.5 million less that's coming out of the local budgets, and that much less affecting the homestead tax rate. And as you can see, the table down below, you can see the huge jump from 22 to 23, and it continues to climb. FY 25 is our budget number. So we may be a little lower than that.
Just to be clear,
Yeah.
As we have gone through the Act 173 transition, sort of as reimbursement becomes constrained through the census block grant, the extraordinary reimbursement became more generous.
Right, yes, yeah.
Yeah, and so we have also two systems issues working here. So one is just the absolute number of students who are eligible for extraordinary has increased, right? So that's just overall more cost in the system. But now what we've done is we've shifted where the revenue for those is coming from local budgets and which comes from the Ed Spend grant and its homestead tax rates. And we're now shifting it over to this categorical state grant, which is coming not out of homestead, but out of kind of the more general pot of funds, right?
It's off the top of.
Off the
It's off the top.
Right.
So it is, we both have increasing costs in the system, but we're also shifting where we are paying for those costs. So there's a little bit of accounting that's happening, right? That is taking some of the pressure off of the local budgets, although we continue to see that spending also go up. So all in all, we're still continuing to see the whole system is more expensive.
So I would assume a question for all of us to ponder is, did we create a perverse incentive to identify more students as meeting the extraordinary costs? Because it does not come out of the local budget.
In our conversations with business managers, when we were doing some of this analysis, that seems to be their analysis of what's happened. So I think that's absolutely an area that deserves additional inquiry.
Right, so I can think of a whole bunch of reasons kids are in special ed. But extraordinary, can you give me like a kind of an illustration of an example of an extraordinary case?
Yeah, so Alicia, do you want to come? We've got a chair for you. Why don't you come on up? So we're going to have we'll have a more in-depth analysis, but I think that you can kind of paint that picture.
Sure. Do I have to introduce myself?
Yes, please, for the record.
I'm Alicia Hanrahan. I work for the Agency of Education not in the special ed team, but in another one. And I do a lot of interagency work. So I work a lot with DCF and mental health and developmental services. These kids that we're going to be talking about are not kids necessarily in DCF custody. So I just want to make sure that that's not included in this. So if you're looking at an extraordinary cost student, so you're looking at somebody who has been placed somewhere, it could be in a regular ed environment in their school district. They could be in an independent school. They could be in a tutorial. They could be in a residential program. So there's 792 kids from the 23-24 school year who fit into the extraordinary cost.
Okay.
So you could have a student who has a hearing loss or is completely deaf and needs maybe 2 interpreters, might need a teacher of the deaf, might need a specialized program, might need not an independent school in Vermont, but maybe a residential program. You could have a student who has significant autism, who might be nonverbal, might be aggressive, might need behavior interventionists, might need speech and language because they need a communication device. These kids are very unique and they're very different one from another. And all of the services that are on the IEP isn't based on an IEP team decision. So does that help?
Absolutely, I
Okay.
absolutely get the picture. Yeah.
Okay.
And from a more baseline, it's when the cost for their services reaches a certain point, they.
Yeah. So we call it like an extraordinary cost student. It has nothing to do with who the kid is. It's just the costs associated with services for that student reach a certain threshold. So it's sort of an odd way to refer to a student. We need to sort of be clear about that. The student is, getting the services that are in their IEP.
And there's some more specifics when we get to the project.
Representative Brady?
But how, I'm just thinking out loud here, so if it's a reimbursement still at that, it's a matter of the real student with the real needs and then the real cost of those services. So how is it that we're potentially incentivizing, or is it just a reality of more students or students whose needs are more expensive?
Yes,
I'm a little confused by the.
yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit? We're going to have to go to the maths So when we look at the change in the formula,
Yeah.
it actually changed. So if you want to maybe walk through a little bit. there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so part one is what the calculation has always been at. Yes, so we have the total cost of the student, 170,000 in this case, minus the high cost threshold. And then we multiply that by 95%. So giving a reimbursement of 98,376. And then FY at 173 added part two, where you take the lesser of the first two calculations, the total cost minus the threshold, or the threshold minus I think that's, I don't know, I wrote this down somewhere else, but that's a base number from the census block grant, I think. Multiplied by 60%. And in any event, the lesser of the two is 38,000 in this case. So Act 173, under Act 173, they're getting 38,000 more. So they're getting reimbursed 136,922 of that 170.
So, Rep. Brady, and I actually would encourage maybe having some members of VASBO come in and provide some testimony on this. Yeah, I think that would be really helpful. In particular, we were talking to Heather Bushy and Morgan Tisdale about this. And they sort of have two different ways that they're providing these services. So they would be, I think, helpful. So what we have heard anecdotally is that if in 173 there were part of the theory of action was sort of putting guardrails up around the system to drive towards more cost effective, right? So a student's IEP is a student's IEP, and they get those services, and those services have to be paid. It's a unique animal in the education funding landscape. But what we've heard from business managers is that because there's significant additional reimbursement under the new formula, that there's maybe a disincentive to look for the most cost-effective way of delivering that service, because the district would actually receive significantly more funding if it kind of crosses that threshold in the new formula. So I think that VASBO would be an excellent partner to come in and provide that analysis, but this is an area that we'll say needs additional inquiry because we're fairly new into this new formula. We're starting to see some trends around this, but the special education system has so many complicating variables that I think it requires and necessitates a more in-depth analysis. So I think, Rep. McCann, did you have a?
I'm questioning the increase in the number of students with extraordinary needs. Are they coming from the pool of students we had? Those students are developing more needs? Or are we becoming known as a state that does a good job with students with extraordinary needs and people are coming with those students? What's happening really?
I don't know if you have a sense of that, Alicia.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's a
Yeah.
little bit all of the above. I would also, so we have had, more kids move in from other states. I don't know if we have any data on that, but I have heard that, periodically over the course of the last few years. I think one of the things that we've noticed a lot is post-COVID, a lot of these kids who may not have kind of reached that level of concern are now coming to school with an intense amount of anxiety, some depression. They've been in their homes. They've watched some of their family members get really ill. So I think the level of mental health supports also aren't there for some of these kids. And so I think some of them are kind of rising a little bit more to the top of having some concerns. I also think that we're sending a lot of kids out of state to residential. Not a lot. We have 23. Last year we had 23 kids out of state placed residentially by their LEAs because they don't have enough supports and services available in their supervisory union. And we've also lost some independent schools in the last several years, Mosaic being one which was in the Morrisville and the Chittenden County area. And they took some really tough kids on the spectrum And a lot of those kids need a lot of supports. There was also the closure of the Howard Center Centerpoint program, which also had a lot of kids with emotional disturbance. So I think there's a variety of reasons why we're getting more kids due to acuity levels as well. I think a lot of these kids are also, they have families who have opioid issues. So there's a lack of services, lack of counseling. It's one of those perfect storms. It's a little bit of everything.
But I'm not sure, I think also nationally, there's
Mhm.
national trends as well.
course.
So and I think this is a deeper analysis for us as well, is nationally, we know the number of students on IEPs is increasing. Are we, on the extreme end of that curve as we sometimes are? I think we don't quite have that level of analysis yet, but it's a good question. Do you want to move to the revenues section, Sean?
We can, sure.
Sorry, that was my bad. We skipped the federal.
Yeah, we can talk, well, I'll back up a tiny bit. So for 24, these four pots of money total 254 million. And we go to the revenues, you'll see the total cost of special ed. So, and the difference comes out of the,
Sorry, where are we in the presentation?
we're still on 11, page 11. And we're going to jump to federal funding right at the bottom. So IDB is our federal funding. We have a small preschool grant, and then the regular IDB grant. And, we're required to, we and the districts are required to maintain a certain level of support for special ed. Maintenance effort for the districts, and it's a fiscal support for the state. So our requirement is to budget for currently more money, or the same or more, the same amount of money or more for special education each year. And then the districts, I think, have a slightly different formula where they have to maintain spending. I don't know if the 90% comes into play there. But
And this is a significant requirement. This isn't one of those ones where you can be out of compliance. If you are out of compliance, then the Department of Education would be saying the state has to reimburse the difference. So this is, as we are contemplating any future changes to how we fund special education, we will be waving the caution flag and saying, we've got to work with the Department of Education so that we can continue to maintain fiscal support. We don't ever want to be out of compliance with that. And that means that we have to really walk them through the potential changes that we would be making and how we could continue to demonstrate that we are supporting all students with disabilities in the state. So this is a really big and significant decision to make when we change the way that we fund special education, and it needs to be done in really close partnership with the Department of Education, or we might, inadvertently put ourselves out of compliance on something that would have real dollar impacts to the state's budget.
This came up a lot when we were discussing Act 173. This is maintenance of financial support, maintenance of effort. And we were hoping that we would have the difficult situation of having reduced our special ed spending so significantly due to the effectiveness of Act 173 that we would have to talk with the Department of Education about why we were showing such tremendous trends. It has not worked out that way.
It's not a problem we have right now. Yeah.
yeah, so the table at the bottom of page 12 shows our federal money through the IDB grant. Looking at 38.5 million in 25. And then we're expecting like a level fund for next year, FY26.
We're still waiting on those allocations.
Right. All right, so we're going to jump to page 18 to continue on the revenues. So the table at the top, that's the table I was talking about, where the total cost for special education in 24 for the districts was 473 million. And through the categorical grants, we funded and federal 258. 0.6 of that, leaving 215 to come out of the local budget and the ed spending grant. So we have some slightly good news that we expect that that deficit will be a little less for 25 as we as that finishes out. So
But that's not because.
Right.
Good
Yeah.
news and bad news. Spending didn't decrease. It's just that the state categorical grant for extraordinary has increased. So that delta between the local budgets where they have to make up the difference and what the state categorical grants is providing is getting smaller. But not that the overall cost of special education is going down, because it's not. It's just being distributed differently.
Right.
Good news and bad news.
The next table shows per student where the funding comes from, and we're seeing about 8% from our federal grant, and then basically the balance is these state dollars we're talking about. And we on over, and our next table or chart talks about the cost per student with an IEP based on the size of the supervisory union. And the smallest two groups have the highest costs for the most part. And we see a small dip in the group 3. And then group 4 has, for some reason, has a slightly higher. So it doesn't quite follow what we might expect. But it's just how the data is.
So I think this is sort of, in this section, we were asked to sort of analyze around some, kind of connections that folks in Ways and Means and in House Ed were sort of wondering about, right? Do we see a correlation between higher costs for special education or per pupil spending for special education in smaller districts, right? So we did the analysis, we tested it, and the answer is there really doesn't seem to be a statistical correlation between those two things, right? So SD size and per pupil spending on special education don't seem to be correlated in a positive way.
Is it not, and I guess statistically, these aren't big numbers, but group 3 is consistently a lower spending district size.
Yeah. It was on this one. I wouldn't necessarily say on other per pupil expenditures. So, yeah, but it's a worthwhile question. Yeah.
Yeah, and the next chart shows, by year, the cost per student based on need and based on the free and reduced lunch numbers. And in here we see hardly any change based on need. So that is quite telling as well.
And one thing that we did see in the state profile, so where we did see a correlation, is that our smaller districts and our higher poverty districts tend to have a larger percentage of students with IEPs. But the cost per pupil, we're not seeing a real statistical correlation between the two.
Yeah, and the final chart, I think, was mentioned earlier, where if a district has a smaller percentage of students with an IEP, their per student costs are higher, and that may be based on getting to a critical mass of students, so they could, it might be a scale issue there. So.
And I think, that sort of meets with common sense, right? So if you get a critical mass of students on IEPs, then you're going to also, again, achieve those economies of scale of services. This is the theory of action behind kind of regional delivery of these services. We already see folks in the field trying to organize themselves in such a way that they are kind of bringing that critical mass. And I would imagine in particular, if you have low incidence, high acuity students, right? Being able to sort of have them collectively together and sort of a center of excellence around that particular disability category would yield cost savings over time. So we're already seeing that. That was sort of the intention behind the BOCES. We know that, again, as we're looking towards ed transformation, this is one of those considerations. How do you get kind of larger numbers of students in a geographic area so that you can serve them at lower cost. Still high quality, and in fact, in some ways, probably better quality because you're going to have more experts sort of working together. But this is the nice thing is it's borne out by the data, which is great, right? So this theory of action that we've all sort of had and it feels like a common sense approach, we actually do have the data to support it, which is good.
This could come in writing later, but I would be curious if there's any further potential BOCES development happening around the state. Asked to talk on it,
Yes,
especially
I-
related to special services, but any in
Yeah, I
particular.
can provide an update. It'd be great. We get a little more at the end.
Yeah, I think we're gonna move to student trend now. Which is
believe
page
so.
13.
We will reintroduce
Yep.
Meg. Come back. And then you'll get to hear from Alicia again when we talk about the extraordinary and dive down inside. You get to see it.
Yes. For the record, I'm Jennifer Hicks. I'm the Division Director for the Data Management and Analysis Division at the agency.
Okay, so we're back to talk about the student trends. So you had asked about the outcomes for students, and my section was about the categories of disability that students fall into, and I'm wondering if maybe that isn't as an interesting thing to talk about right now as the outcomes for all students with disabilities.
Yeah, if we follow that, yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's why I dragged Jen up with me. So we're on around page 15 and the 16. The upshot is that our students with disabilities, the gap between students with disabilities performance on our statewide assessments and the students without disabilities is very large. You can see the trends, the bottom of page 16, looking at those little bars. All students who receive free and reduced lunch, students who are English language learners, and then the label is special education, but it's a student with an IEP. And that is valid both for the English language arts and outcomes for students.
And you can see here the 2 years that are presented. It's the Smarter Balance assessment that we did previously, then we changed assessments to the VCAP. You see the same trends, you see the same range of differences, about 30 to 40% difference between those on IEPs and all students. And you also see sort of a similar pattern where the overall scores in English language are higher than they are in math a little bit. And then I can talk about the performance trends of students in the therapeutic schools. As we said earlier, the number of students in therapeutic schools is so small that we can't give a statistical analysis with graphs and charts, but the descriptive analysis that comes through is fairly similar. That it's administered annually. The VCAP is administered annually to students in grades 3 through 9. And the results for the students with the most significant cognitive disabilities are not included in this because they take a separate assessment than the VCAP. So these are the VCAP results, not the alternative assessment results. All students, as with all students, as with all students, those attending the therapeutic schools demonstrate stronger performance in English language arts than they do in mathematics. And the students that are in the therapeutic settings have a slightly lower on average performance than students on an IEP in the regular school setting. It's important to interpret this with caution though, because assessment outcomes are influenced by primary disability category, and that can differ across education settings. And the results shouldn't be, this interpretation shouldn't be taken as a standalone report on the quality of education.
Any questions about that? These results are, nationally, we see that gap. It's absolutely our focus is to close that gap as much as we can.
My only question would be, I mean, when you're talking about comparing a student on an IEP, especially at a certain disability level to a general education student, I mean, aren't you going to expect to find gaps that may or may not be able to be closed?
I think depending on the student, I would expect that students who are able to receive that supplemental intervention and instruction would actually be able to make up ground when everything's working well for those students. So I think that we would want to see we followed a kid year over year close.
I think throughout all of this, I think what we're looking for, actually what you're looking for, is there data that sort of supports or backs up some, action that works better one way or the other. And while you said that students in a school setting versus students in an isolated therapeutic setting tend to test a little better, I think I heard you say that the numbers are so small that you really shouldn't necessarily derive a conclusion from that.
I don't think I don't think that this is enough for a correlation or a causation. It was just the fact that came from the numbers of.
Well, I'm thinking about what you just said and asked, and I say also as a teacher, it just logically feel that some students are never, and we always want to meet all students' needs and get them as far as possible, but that, some students with certain disabilities are never going to achieve certain levels on a grade 8 math. And then when I look back at how you've broken down our designations, that the two places, and the one in particular that stands out that we have a high percentage, 12% above the national average, is developmental delay, which I imagine is a group that might in particular be very challenged to ever, regardless of the strength of the special education system, potentially be at a, I guess I don't know exactly how developmental delay is defined, but I wonder, are there national standards or in the accountability at the federal level that says what percentage of your kids on IEPs, regardless of disability, should be meeting your standards?
Yeah, so that goes all the way back around to when we started. So one of the places where Vermont has, one of the reasons that we are in that needs assistance is how well students do on our state assessments. And I think, I don't want to start saying numbers out loud, but I think that both things can be true. So what you said can be true, but also we can recognize that we're not meeting the needs of not only the students with IEPs, but also the students without, because we know that the proficiency numbers are also decreasing. So that's where we go back to our system and are we ensuring that all students are getting what they need in that general education classroom, and teacher efficacy and all of those things. I think that this is the example. We see the poster sometimes of when there's a snowy walkway into the school, and if you shovel the ramp, everyone can go up. I think that's what we're talking about, is improving the system. Students with disabilities will benefit, and all students will benefit at the same time.
Am I correct that developmental delay is actually our largest category of students with disabilities?
Oh, I didn't, largest in terms of sort of the outlier versus the national average, but that we had about.
I thought that was.
In our State of the State report, and that's linked in the
in the document, we highlighted when there are areas where we are outside of the national norm.
Yeah.
And so we tend to have more students that are diagnosed with emotional disturbances.
Yeah.
We also tend to have more students that are in a separate school setting than the national average as well.
I was looking at page 14, but I was looking for where are we outliers?
That I remember
Yeah. That was one of the high outliers, was developmental delay.
I'll see what.
Then one would hope that that's caught early,
That's right.
intervened with early, and by the time a student gets, you know,
Yeah. And I think as we
Either
we
get
talked
closer.
about some of the policy implications, it's ensuring that students have access to interventionists, right? That's a really important part of this. That they have access to a special education teacher. We know that some of our districts started this year and we're not able to meet that staffing. And our team has been providing some additional support and guidance around how to navigate that when it occurs. And so as we're thinking about these policy considerations, we want to make sure that we're being equitable. And a lot of that has to do with access to these resources. So just think we need to keep that in mind as the committee over the summer and fall is thinking about district size. This is a really important part of service delivery and gets explicitly at quality.
I will ask one policy question because I think it's one that we're going to be facing over the next couple of weeks. And that is, we currently have a moratorium on approved independent schools, and that includes therapeutic schools. And we talk about access to services. Is that something you would be reconsidering?
So we were asked that early in the session. And I think we're seeing this as a broader challenge. So we'll talk about, and Alicia will be able to expand on some of the other work that is happening in districts to providing some of that support. So we think it's really, again, it's a complicated challenge. We do know that there are long wait lists at many of the therapeutic schools. Alicia had highlighted some closures of schools that may have contributed to that. But, you know, we're also seeing different patterns across the state in terms of utilization and the higher expenses when it comes to extraordinary. So we do think that it is a chance to step back and look at what other types of systems may need to be embedded within our districts so that they have those resources so that wouldn't necessarily need the separate schools. And we want to make sure a child is in the most inclusive setting for them that supports their learning. So that's always the case. So I think it's a conversation. I don't think there's a one answer to that. And we will highlight in our next section what some districts are doing that we think would be valuable to look at.
Great.
That's my second. So you get the fancy too.
The fancy too.
You're the queen.
I love that. Okay. Sorry. No, sorry. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to talk about the extraordinary cost students, and if I move back into high cost students, it's not on purpose. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 792 kids who have been considered high cost in the 23-24 school year, and they are from every supervisory union or school district with the exception of 3, one being Lincoln, one being Mill River, which is in the Rutland area, and one being Franklin Northeast Supervisory Union, which is in the Richford, Enosburg, Montgomery area, right up on the Canadian border. So we've been looking at extraordinary cost students for as long as I can remember, and I've been around for 26 years, so it's been at least 20 years. And it used to be we would have a small handful of kids and we would get copies of IEPs. We would look through them 4 times a year and say, okay, so this Johnny has, $100,000 worth of costs. We'd look at the IEP and say, okay, where are these costs coming from? And so we would kind of look through that. And it was a very short period of time when we did that. And now it's much more significant. So we look at it still 4 times a year on what we call worksheet B. So the supervisory unions will send us the worksheet, and it's broken down by student, broken down into what their primary disability is. It's broken down into what type of school they're going to. It's broken down into tuition costs, whether or not they're residentially placed, equipment, which I didn't include on this list because it's very minuscule in comparison. Transportation, related services, other instructional costs. So it's a lot. And for 792 kids, it's really a lot. So once the school districts hit that threshold of, so for the year we're talking about, it was $66,206. So once the school district hits that threshold, then they can start asking the agency for reimbursement up to 95% above and beyond. So what I wanted to do is go through some of the basic information about these students. So we had 23 students during this time frame who were in residential placements. I would say 100% of those were out of state. We only have a couple of residential facilities that LEAs can place kids in Vermont. 294 were attending public schools, most of them in state, just a couple out of state. 463 in independent schools, 11 in tutorials, and one I couldn't verify. It was a program, and I didn't get a call back from school. So when you take a look at when you break down the students from the 792, what are their disability categories? Kind of going back to some of the questions that you had earlier, you can see that 60%, the big ones are 60% who are categorized as having.
What page are?
Oh, I'm so sorry, 22. 60 of them have intellectual disabilities, 294 with emotional disturbance, 101 with other health impairment. And that could be a student with ADHD, or it could be a student with some significant health issues. Specific learning disability, one of our highest disability categories in Vermont, we have 20. Multiple disabilities, 45, and this could be a student who has multiple disabilities based on special education. So they could be eligible for emotional disturbance, intellectual disabilities, and speech and language, let's say. Developmental delay has 38. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up was that developmental delay, when you're talking about kids, it's the younger ones up until usually 3 to 5, but then they can have their disability category until close to 9. The reason I want to bring it up is because developmental services like the Department of Aging and Independent Living considers somebody with like an adult with a disability of developmental delay to have an IQ of like 70 or less. So it's not apples and apples. Okay. And then our other really big category is autism spectrum disorder. So that makes up the bulk of the students who are in the ICOS category. And then some of them are residentially placed. Again, most of them are more in independent schools. The overall extraordinary cost for this time frame was $86 million. So it's gone up from the previous year quite a bit. I have not gone back and done any analysis on previous years to break it down. But what you can see a little bit further down is that we took a look at the percentage of extraordinary cost students by disability category overall throughout the entire state. And some of it is pretty significant and some of it is not. And when I say significant, I don't mean statistically significant. I just want to make sure you understand that. You know, almost 14% of kids with emotional disability is considered an extraordinary cost. Almost 14.5% hearing loss. Again, smaller population of students. Intellectual disabilities and multiple disabilities make up the next two larger categories. And so again, a lot of these kids are actually getting supports and services within their public school, and they're getting them in other places as well. I think we have seen a different, we've seen an increase in the last few years for kids going to residential facilities. And for some of those kids, it's because there aren't enough supports and services within their own communities. If you take a look at even just the hearing loss population, we don't have the Austin School for the Deaf anymore. So, and if you've got little pockets of kids with hearing loss, it's hard to get them together to you know, use a lot of resources and have like a cohort and a peer group for some of these kids. So if you're needing a kid with 2 interpreters, or if you're needing a teacher of the deaf, some of these kids might be going to residential facilities because that might make the most sense. It might be their least restrictive environment.
There was a question that was asked, which is there a correlation between an LEA that that's non-operating at the high school level, by sending more students to a placement than if they are an operating district at any grade level?
Yes. Page 28. So what I did was I took a look at the 5 supervisory unions that don't operate high schools. So you're looking at Bennington Rutland, which is down in the Manchester area, Kingdom East, which is in Lindenville, St. Johnsbury, Lincoln, which is just a K-8 school or K-6, and then Grand Isle, which doesn't have a high school either. So I did take a look at some of those high-cost disabilities. Bennington Rutland, who has 40 kids, half of them were going to public schools, and then the other half were kind of going in different places. And what I did was I kind of broke it up into like high school age and elementary age. So I don't know if there's necessarily a correlation. I think when you take a look later at, maybe it's earlier, specifically at St. Johnsbury and Bennington Rutland. So if you go back to page 26 and you're taking a look at the percentage of students requiring extraordinary costs per supervisory union, Bennington Rutland has 10% of their population. And again, they don't have a high school, so 10% of their population is extraordinary costs. And then if you look at, I think St. Johnsbury was another one that was high.
Yeah, 8%.
What percent?
8%.
8%. I can't find where it is. Yeah, 8%. And then there was one more that was that was a little bit higher. Oh, Wyndham Southwest, which is the Whitingham, Wilmington. They're smack dab between Bennington and Brattleboro at 16.5%. And then Springfield was another one. So there's a lot of information here. I think it makes sense to kind of maybe look back and see where we've been and where we're planning on going. I think, you know, again, we've got a lot of these high cost kids that are going away, and then what are they coming back to? So one of the things that I don't know if there's going to be alternative programs built in their school district to support kind of a step down from an independent school. I do know that there are a lot of public schools that have started having conversations, and they've been building some internal programs. What I found to be really interesting is if you take a look at Rutland City's number of high-cost students, they have 2. Rutland City is a really big school district, have a lot of kids. They have a lot of kids on IEPs, and they only have 2 high-cost kids. They also have alternative programs within their district. They also have Allen Street campus, which is an off-campus school. I think it's K through 12, supports a lot of kids with emotional disturbance in it. Essex Westford has developed some programs. I know that the Hartford has a collaborative where they have an autism program. I think they have an ED program as well. There's just a lot of different pockets of supervisory unions that have either some collaboratives going on, or they have some internal programs that are supporting these kids, which is great for kids when they're coming back from like independent schools or residential programs. I think I don't know if those particular schools that have alternative programs have entrance and exit criteria. I don't know if they have data to show how successful. So if you've had 200 kids go through your alternative program and 2 have only transitioned back into the mainstream, is that a good program? I don't know. But then thinking about kind of moving forward, what's the criteria that you want to develop?
Do we get in trouble though with programs like that? I mean, if they aren't returning to the general ed classroom, does the federal government all of a sudden say you have a program where kids are not in the least restrictive environment and therefore you're in violation of IDEA? I basically say that out of experience, our high school ran a program like that was beloved by parents, but was definitely not beloved by regulators.
I think if you always want to move towards having any student in a regular ed environment. I mean, that your mainstream should be your least restrictive environment. I don't know if we're getting in trouble at all for for the percentages that we have out there, but that's always where we want to go. We want to bring kids back, give them the skills that they need, and then bring them back to where they can be with their peers and the general ed teachers.
Representative Conlon, I think this gets back to your prior question. It was really a policy question around, what are the needs in our system? Do we need to add additional independent therapeutic schools? Is that something that we could consider? And I think what we had proposed early in the session is it would benefit us to have a study and looking at the oversight and support for therapeutic schools and really being to analyze the broader needs and evaluate the success of these programs that are embedded within systems to be able to provide a more holistic recommendation for policy. Because I think what you're hearing is we've done some of the preliminary analysis, but there's a deeper review that would be needed to really inform that type of a policy direction.
And I think that it is a debated question among those of us making policy because that moratorium is causing the conversations to happen to have embedded programs in schools.
It may be something to meet some of the immediate needs of the wait list, but it doesn't negate the need to have a broader systems review of how we're delivering and supporting special education across the state and embedding that and making sure there's access to resources. So I think it would need to be a both and conversation.
I think in addition, a lot of the things that I'm hearing in the field is that in addition to there being a long waiting list for independent schools, there are a lot of kids who are receiving tutoring services because they can't access the general ed curriculum in the public school. There isn't an independent school. They might be waiting for residential, they might not be. And tutoring services for, a very aggressive high schooler, maybe 2 hours of tutoring a day if they decide to access it. A lot of these kids are really struggling to access something because we just don't have specifically what they need.
I do want to be cognizant of time. We need to be back in our room at 3. And I do want to make sure we get to the Medicaid. So I appreciate all this. But I also don't want to rush you because yours is probably some of the most important information we're getting today. Do continue to get more.
No, if I have anything.
I
think that was where I was landing. Are there any questions?
I have one that's a little, when you talk about tutoring programs, what does that mean?
So we do have a process through the independent school team that has an approved tutorial criteria. So we have 4 or 5 of those in the state where a student would go sometimes full day, like Beckley Day program that's run by Washington County Mental Health has one. The Baird School has kind of their TABS program. So kids go there and they get tutoring. And a lot of times they get like a full day worth of school, but it's called tutoring. They have a curriculum or they don't, and they might go and just teach individual subjects for kids. That's an approved tutorial. That's different from tutoring, which is.
How's that approved tutorial?
Yeah, okay. The regular tutoring is just the kid shows up and gets, the 2 hours per subject per week plus their special ed services for an older kid.
It would be provided through the school or the district.
Yes. Yes.
But an approved tutorial acts more as a sort of independent school.
A little bit more, yes. The rules are a little bit different.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Appreciate it. Is now, I don't want to shortchange this, but is now the time to switch to the Medicaid discussion?
Yes, we can switch that discussion. If you have any questions for us after you've had an opportunity to review the report, please do send them our way so we can more fully address them. I know in H54 there is a focus on developing a strategic plan for special education. The way that we're approaching this is it's part of our overall strategic plan as an agency, and you can see that this is a really key objective for us. As you look at some of that language, there's some of the data requests that may be redundant from what we're bringing in here. And also there's a real intent for us to move forward into thinking around our implementation planning. So would welcome the opportunity to come back and really unpack that further. We've shared with you some of the ways that we are really rebuilding our monitoring approach. And that's a fundamental that is needed and a key foundation for us to be successful. moving forward. And I think another part of this, and you'll see this in the conclusion of our report, there are certain areas where we've identified a need to strengthen the Agency of Education's training and support. And we've also identified a need for more systems level improvement. We've identified in this report some of the structural barriers that we've talked through. And as we move into training with the field, it's also important that we're looking at this as our collective responsibility and making sure that we're really understanding those roles and responsibilities at each level. And so part of that, what we'll see is the agency providing additional training resources and tools and increased that accountability as well.
Yeah, I think just from a strictly monetary point of view and trying to take pressure off the ed fund, I think it's a certain sort of looking at those extraordinary costs. And so sort of how we got here and what we do to back off those is just really important. Great. If everybody can hold that, we will not take a break. We will not stop the live feed that we have now. We'll just switch right into the Medicaid presentation. So please, that was very, very helpful.
Yes, right, okay.
So as they're making their way up, so I am very, very pleased to introduce to you Cassandra Ryan, who is the agency's new CFO. Cassandra's been with the state forever.
A little shy of forever,
Forever.
but 20 years, a bit of time. yes.
And she was our Director of Regulatory Compliance and Risk Management, and has been a wonderful partner as we navigated our way through the COVID funds and whatever other slings and arrows have come our way. She's really well known to the field, has really been supportive and providing training to them for years and years. So we're thrilled. I'm going to give a shout out to Sean for his wonderful service as interim CFO, and he is very happily back in his deputy CFO position. And we're just really, really thrilled. So and then I will let Cassandra introduce Katie, and then I'm going to step out of the way and you get the center stage.
All right, great. Hi. So yes, second introduction is Katie Smith. We are so pleased. Katie is taking over as the Medicaid director. So she is on the Friday of her third week. But we hired her for a reason, right? We're super excited. She's got a great amount of experience with the program, and she's actually bringing a lot of knowledge, and she's here already, right, on week 3. So
Welcome.
yes, thank you. Now, did Annie step out? We had a PowerPoint. I'm not sure.
We will, if you don't mind, we'll just look at it on our screen.
Right, let me, if you don't mind, I'll just grab my laptop.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
I would like to introduce myself for the record. I'm Ashley Weiner. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm the Director of Medicaid Policy for the Agency of Human Services, and I am co-presenting with the Agency of Education today as we're really here to talk about school-based services, which is a Medicaid component of our education system. And Medicaid is administered out of the Agency of Human Services. And as we go through this slide deck today, I just want the committees to keep in mind the broader context in which Medicaid exists, which is this really massive health program for many Vermonters. About a third of Vermonters in the state are on Medicaid, and it covers a very broad swath of services providers, one of which is this school-based health services program that we're going to talk about today.
Thank you.
Great. I think Ashley's gonna start us off.
Sure. So did I hear that the committee is just going to go through slides on their own?
Yes, we're a little technologically shortchanged right now. Shorthanded.
Okay, no problem. So on slide number 2 here, Medicaid school-based services program overview, just to give a little flavor of what we're talking about. Medicaid pays for medically necessary health services and Medicaid administrative services provided to eligible students in Vermont schools. On the next slide, we're going to get into what makes a student eligible. But first, let's say that, on the next slide, we're going to talk about which students are eligible. But to be eligible, you have to have 2 things. You have to be enrolled in Vermont Medicaid, And you have to have an individualized education plan or individualized family service plan that includes a medically necessary health service. So if you're just Medicaid eligible, but you don't have an IEP or an IFSP, you're not getting school-based services. Or if you have an IEP, but you're not Medicaid eligible, you're not getting Medicaid school-based services. Under this program, Medicaid payments are made to the school supervisory union or local education agency, as school staff are the ones that are actually providing the health service and Medicaid administrative services to students. All LEAs in the state of Vermont participate in the Medicaid school-based services program, which really is a impressive stat when you look at school-based services nationally. I think we can be really proud that all of our schools are participating at this level. It's not something that we take for granted. On slide 3, this is just a list of covered school-based services and providers. You'll see a long host of services listed under health services, and this is going to vary by school. Some schools have capacity for these services or a subset of these services, while other schools may not have that capacity. And it really varies depending on what schools are employing which provider types. But this is the breadth of what can be eligible under the Medicaid program. Okay, moving on to the next slide is just that Venn diagram of who's eligible for school-based services. As I said before, we have students receiving IEP services, special education services. They make up about 73% of which are Medicaid eligible. And then we have on the other side, students who are eligible for Medicaid, of which that's about 54% of Vermont students. And then in the middle there are the ones that we can actually claim federal match to cover those school-based services. So not hearing any questions, I'm gonna hand it over to
Doing great, thank you.
Cassandra to get into the finances.
Great. Well, we've got a couple of slides for you. So if we move on to slide 5, that just gives us a little bit of a look of the trend of the revenue that's coming in, and that's the complete revenue that's coming in for the school-based health services part of the program. So again, as we're keeping the big picture in mind, now we're talking a little bit of the smaller picture. So school-based health services. And as you look, you can see the fiscal year total revenue that's being generated by that program. Fairly stable. So if we just look at FY24, we're at 27.5 million. Just to give an idea. We'll move on to slide 6, where we break out what happens to the 27.5 million. How does that get distributed to our school districts? And what part of it gets distributed to our school districts? So we actually distribute per statute, which tells us that 50% will be granted back to our school districts. And we pay that out at the Agency of Education. We send them 5 grant payments per year. Quarterly, with 2 in the last quarter, so 2 in that final quarter of the fiscal year. It's paid out proportionally to what they earn, so that 50% is based on what they're drawing. And the funds have to be used for intervention or prevention programs, and we do stay in touch with them. They report to us each year on that spending. The balance, the other 50%, 30% actually is allowed to be reserved and spent at the state level. It's appropriated by the General Assembly, and it can be used at the Agency of Education or the Agency of Human Services for our program administration costs and other types of costs. So I would say that we are not spending the full 30%. And what happens then? Well, all the remaining funds, so at least 20%, but often more, those funds are deposited in the Ed Fund. So they actually make their way into the Ed Fund. Then if we move to slide 7, this slide was really helpful for me as I tried to make sure I understood the perspective here of the total impacts of this program. We're talking, mostly about the Ed Fund today, but I thought it was very interesting when we try to keep in our minds, the whole total of the program. So we've got total federal revenue of 22 million in 24, 24 million in 23, and then that 25.8 in 22. Of that, you'll see, we'll go back to 24, 13.6 million goes to our schools in those grant awards. So those payments that we're making to them annually, that's that first 50%. And then 8.5 million for 24 was deposited into the ed fund. And for perspective, that comes out to less than 0.5% of the ed fund. So it's a very small piece of the pie of the ed fund. Any questions on that?
I think my only question is, this is separate and apart from Success Beyond 6, right?
Yes.
So now, if there's no other questions about, it's a fairly simple calculation, right? How it all gets distributed. If there's no other questions, which I'm happy to answer, but we'll pass it back to Ashley to go over the federal context and future considerations of the program.
All right, you guys are really making up for lost time here. So, this is a really hard conversation to have, and if any of you have snuck into the testimonies that I've given on for House appropriations or Senate appropriations on the federal context, it's a really serious moving target right now. It's a dynamic issue, as anyone who's following the news in Washington knows. And so what I can say today is we are waiting to hear what will happen in Washington coming to the Medicaid program. We're hearing that they are contemplating changes that could have quite significant impacts to our program. But it is going to be a pretty big uphill battle for them to get these cuts through. So we're just waiting and preparing as best we can to understand what impacts ultimately get passed. Assuming that anything comes through that significantly impacts the Medicaid budget, we really have 4 levers to deal with major budgetary changes to the Medicaid program. And I'm talking big picture Medicaid here right now, not school-based services. And that's backfilling with state general fund dollars, reducing rates, reducing eligibility, or reducing services. When we zoom into the context of public education, a lot of those levers get taken off the table. Medically necessary services for children are mandatory Medicaid coverage. So we cannot eliminate coverage of that list of clinical services for kids under 21. So that lever is just gone. Even if we have huge cuts to the Medicaid program, eliminating those services is not an option. We also have floors for our eligibility group. There are income levels right now in the state of Vermont that are higher than the federal requirement. So individual families can make a higher income than what we're federally obligated to require. And so that is a point of leverage, just to say Medicaid eligibility at large, that 54% of Vermont public schools kids that are on Medicaid, that is an area where we're just paying attention to. And of course, no one wants to reduce eligibility. That's absolutely not a goal. But when we look at those 4 levers and see some of the things being contemplated, that is a potential area where we look. And then finally, rates. Rates are something that are not really at play when we look at how we're funding school-based services, because it's based on the actual provision of service delivery within the school, which is done through a public system. So unlike paying a private hospital a particular rate, we're actually getting the state match from our property taxes and school system, and that's going in. So rates aren't really a lever. And all that to say, I am staying up at night over what is happening in DC. It is a real concern, and we're paying really close attention to how that's going to hit our Medicaid program. But there really isn't much play when it comes to Medicaid coverage of school-based services in the state. And so I hope that it brings me comfort to hear that. I hope that these committees can take some comfort in that fact that we have mandatory coverage of these services, and it's not a place where we're really seeing any play when we're thinking about how to withstand big budget hits.
Except, I think I heard you say that when, just within the realm of school-based health services, is Medicaid eligibility would be the lever that could be used to reduce that cost.
General Medicaid eligibility is one of the four levers that we're looking at large. Yes.
Yeah.
So can I clarify that point? So the rules would allow us to change Medicaid eligibility, which would include children or kids up to 21, but you can't cut services for kids, essentially.
Right.
But you could change eligibility for, hopefully none of this come to pass. But
Yes. Yes. With that big caveat,
Yeah,
hopefully none of it comes to pass.
Yeah.
Right. We have income levels at 317% of federal poverty level for children today. And we are not only obligated to cover up to 138% of federal poverty. So there's quite a bit of headroom there. We also have many other areas of optional coverage in the state of Vermont where we would be looking to, I think, naturally would be a place where we would look before we would ever get to reductions in income level for Medicaid eligibility. But that, as we look at some of these catastrophic proposals that are talking about cutting 25% of the Medicaid program state by state, we're really putting everything on the table to just understand impact.
Where does Success Beyond 6 fit into this? Since
Success
that is,
Beyond, sorry.
that is one area of Medicaid funding to schools.
Yes, Success Beyond 6 is administered out of the Department of Mental Health. And like school-based services, it's medically necessary services to kids under 21. So those would continue to be mandatory services being provided. That it would not be an area subject to whether we have any discretion there.
Other than eligibility.
Other than eligibility, yes.
Do you know what the number, what the, it's great, you've got 25 and down to 22 million within school-based health services. Do you know what the Success Beyond 6 number is that currently flows to the education system? A much bigger number, I imagine.
Yes, it is a much bigger number. I do not know that off the top of my head, but we can follow up.
It just, is there a realm, is it $200 million? Is it $50 million? Or is it even not hard? Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. And as you say, you are spending your time and your staff's time in trying to sort of brace yourself and figure out how to move the levers in the fairest, most equitable way. Big picture Medicaid.
I think we're really trying to understand what levers exist. It's going to be a really important conversation in the State House if some of this comes to pass, and in the administration about what actually gets exercised. But we're right now just doing the analysis of what's even in play here, and that it's not we're not really making judgment calls right now. We're really just trying to understand what we have any ability to move on, because Medicaid regulation is so clear in some areas about what is mandatory, what is optional or discretionary. And in some areas, it's a lot less clear. So we're really trying to do that analysis and make sure we understand the full breadth of impact and then how we can potentially respond, but understand that how we respond is going to be a much broader conversation.
Meanwhile, in Washington, they're coming up against the political realities of what it would mean to cut Medicaid.
That's right. And I think it's really important to note that some of the things that in February I was testifying about in this room that were really nightmarish scenarios, losing $500 million a year or $200 million a year and a couple of different a la carte menu options that they're considering. Those have gone from very likely to not very likely in the matter of the last month. So we're no longer really seriously thinking about provider or per capita caps on our Medicaid budget anymore, which who knows what will happen, but it is somewhat comforting to see that that is way less likely than it was. We're also seeing that eliminating the Medicaid expansion population, or that new adult group that was created under the Affordable Care Act, that was a really popular proposal back in January and February. It's gone way down on the list now. So some of those really big proposals that we're going to have, just that we're going to decimate state Medicaid programs, have really moved down on the list of probability, which is great news for Vermont. What we're seeing now are more obscure, kind of wonkier proposals that will still have a really big impact, but aren't going to completely slash and burn the Medicaid budget the way some of the things we had been seeing earlier this year would have. Not out of the woods, but it's a much better picture than it looked like 6 weeks ago.
Great. Thank you. Committee, any questions? I'm going to just have us adjourn right now because it'll keep us on time for a quick 3 o'clock meeting in our committee room as well. But I do want to thank all of you from the agency, all agencies, for taking the time and really